The room was silent. Not the polite silence of a business meeting, but the heavy, careful silence of men who had spent their lives surrounded by power. A long table stretched across the center of the private hall. 10 seats, 10 men. Each one controlled money, territory, and people who would follow orders without hesitation. But on this night, all eyes were fixed on the man at the head of the table, Kang Min-jae, the youngest leader the organization had ever seen, and the one many believed would not last. He sat slightly lower than the others. Not by choice. The wheelchair made that unavoidable. His posture was still, calm, controlled. But the chair told a story that his rivals loved repeating. A failed assassination attempt years earlier had damaged his spine. Since then, whispers had followed him everywhere. He's too weak to lead. The organization needs someone stronger. It's only a matter of time. And tonight, one of those whispers had decided to speak out loud. Across the table sat Chairman Park. Older, louder, a man who had spent decades building fear into his reputation. He leaned back slowly, studying Min-jae with a thin smile. Then he laughed. Not a friendly laugh. The kind meant to embarrass. "You know," Park said, tapping his fingers on the table, "our fathers built this empire with strength." His eyes dropped to the wheelchair. And strength requires standing. A few men in the room shifted in their seats. No one laughed. But no one stopped him either. Park leaned forward now. His voice grew sharper. "Tell me, Chairman Kang, when negotiations turn ugly, when enemies push harder, how exactly do you plan to keep control from that chair?" The insult hung in the air. Some of the men lowered their eyes. Others watched closely. Because this was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would Min-jae explode? Would he try to prove something? Would he threaten Park? Instead, he said nothing. Not a word. He simply looked at the man across from him. Calm. Still. Unmoving. And that silence only encouraged Park further. The older man stood from his chair slowly, hands behind his back, pacing along the edge of the table. "You lost your fiancée," Park continued. "Your allies are questioning you. And now you bring us here to talk about loyalty." He stopped walking, turned, and pointed directly at Min-jae. "Loyalty follows power, and power requires strength." A few seconds passed. Then Park delivered the line he had clearly been waiting to say. "Tell us honestly, are you still capable of leading this organization?" The question echoed through the room. Every man present understood what it meant. This wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge. If Min-jae failed to respond correctly, control of the organization could begin shifting that very night. Eyes moved back to the man in the wheelchair. Waiting, measuring, judging. But before Min-jae could say anything, someone else moved. At first, no one noticed. She had been standing quietly behind him the entire time. Near the wall, just outside the circle of attention, a woman, young, unknown. Her presence had gone completely ignored during the meeting. Until now. She stepped forward. Just one step. The sound of her heel touching the floor pulled several heads in her direction. Park frowned. He looked confused. Because in this room, strangers did not speak. Yet she walked forward anyway. Calm. Steady. Until she was standing just behind Min-jae's chair. Park scoffed. "Who exactly is this?" No one answered. He looked around the table. Then back at Min-jae. "You brought a guest to a council meeting?" Still silence. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried clearly through the room. "Chairman Park," she said. The older man froze for half a second. Not because of her tone, but because she knew his name. "You asked how Chairman Kang plans to keep control," she continued. Park folded his arms. "Oh, and you're here to explain it." She nodded slightly. "Yes." Several men exchanged looks. This had already crossed every boundary of protocol. But something about the way she stood there, calm, steady, completely unafraid, made the room listen. She reached into a folder she had been holding, placed it gently on the table, then slid it toward Chairman Park. The paper stopped directly in front of him. "Before you question his strength," she said quietly, "you might want to review your own situation." Park's smile returned. Slow, dismissive. He opened the folder. At first, he didn't react. His eyes moved across the page, then to the next, and the next. The smile disappeared. The room grew even quieter. Park's fingers tightened against the paper. Several men leaned forward, trying to see, trying to understand. Finally, Park slammed the folder shut. His face had changed completely. "How did you get this?" The woman didn't raise her voice. "Your offshore accounts," she said calmly. "Your private security payments. Your agreement with the Busan faction." The entire table froze. One of the older men whispered under his breath, because everyone in that room understood what those words meant. Chairman Park hadn't just insulted the leader. He had been preparing to replace him. The woman continued speaking, still calm, still precise. "We also documented the meeting you held last Tuesday." Park's eyes widened. "With 3 captains from the Eastern District," she added. "They were planning to announce their support for you tonight." Silence filled the room. Park looked around quickly. Several of the men he expected to back him were now staring at the table, avoiding his eyes. The woman closed the folder gently, then stepped back behind Min-jae's chair. And only then did the man everyone had been watching finally speak. His voice was quiet, almost relaxed. "Chairman Park," Min-jae said. The older man didn't answer. "You asked whether I'm capable of leading." Min-jae glanced around the table, at every man present, then back at Park. "I believe you have your answer." No one spoke. No one moved, because in the span of 60 seconds, everything had changed. The insult, the challenge, the power in the room, all of it. And suddenly the men who doubted him understood something they had completely missed. The wheelchair had never made Kang Min-jae powerless. If anything, it had made people underestimate him. And that mistake had just destroyed Chairman Park. But even that wasn't the most shocking part, because as the room sat there in stunned silence, many of them were still staring at the woman standing quietly behind his chair. No one knew her name. No one knew where she came from. Yet she had just exposed one of the most powerful men in the organization, without raising her voice. And Kang Min-jae trusted her enough to let her speak in a room like this, which raised a question none of them could ignore. Who was she? And how had she gained that kind of influence? The truth was something no one in that room could have guessed, because just 3 months earlier, that same woman had been sleeping inside a worn-down car in a grocery store parking lot, alone, broke, and completely invisible to the world. 3 months. That was all the time it took. 3 months for a woman no one had ever heard of to walk into one of the most guarded meetings in the criminal world and silence a man who had spent decades building his authority. 3 months earlier, no one in that room would have recognized her. No security file carried her name. No intelligence report mentioned her. No rival faction considered her relevant. And yet, on that night, in front of some of the most powerful figures in the organization, she held information capable of destroying a man's reputation in seconds. Which raises the question that still puzzles many who studied the events that followed. How did she get there? How does someone move from sleeping inside a car to standing behind the most powerful man in a criminal empire? The answer begins with another question. Why would a mafia boss marry a complete stranger? Not a political ally. Not the daughter of another crime family. Not someone raised inside that world. A stranger. A woman with no protection, no connections, and no influence. It made no sense. And that was exactly why it worked. Because 3 months earlier, Kang Min-jae was facing a crisis that threatened everything he had inherited. His leadership was already under pressure. The assassination attempt that left him in a wheelchair had changed the way people looked at him. Respect had turned into quiet doubt. Doubt had turned into whispers. And whispers had started turning into plans. Inside organizations built on power and loyalty, perception matters as much as strength. Once people begin to question a leader, they start looking for someone else to follow. But what truly pushed the situation to the edge was not an attack from enemies. It was something far more personal, a rejection, public, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. Because the woman who rejected him wasn't just his fiancée. She represented an alliance, a carefully arranged marriage meant to stabilize his position. Their union would have connected two powerful families. It would have silenced critics. It would have warned rivals not to challenge him. Instead, the engagement ended in a moment that spread through the organization like wildfire. The message was clear. If even his future wife didn't believe in his strength, why should anyone else? Within days, the balance of power began shifting. Meetings started happening behind closed doors. Phone calls were made late at night. Men who once stood beside him began standing a little farther away. And that was when Kang Min-jae made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He decided to marry someone else. Immediately. But not another heiress. Not another political alliance. A stranger. A woman no one in his world had ever seen before. When the announcement first surfaced, many assumed it was a rumor. Something created to distract rivals. Something temporary. But the marriage papers were real. The ceremony happened quietly. And within days, the unknown woman had moved into the center of one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. People inside the organization couldn't understand it. Who was she? Why her? What could she possibly offer someone like Kang Min-jae? Some believed she was a temporary shield, a distraction. Others believed something else entirely, that she had secrets no one had uncovered yet. But the truth was something far more unusual, because the decision that brought them together had nothing to do with romance. It wasn't driven by affection. It wasn't driven by destiny. It began with desperation. A moment when humiliation forced a powerful man to rethink everything he believed about strength, loyalty, and survival. And it began with a single encounter that almost never happened. A quiet moment in an ordinary place. Two strangers crossing paths. One of them fighting to keep control of an empire. The other simply trying to survive another night without a home. At that point in time, neither of them could have imagined where that moment would lead. But looking back now, investigators and insiders agree on one thing. That meeting changed the direction of everything that followed. Because the woman who entered Kang Min-jae's life during his lowest moment would eventually become the one person his enemies feared the most. And the first step toward that transformation began long before the Mafia meeting, long before the marriage, long before anyone in that world even knew her name, long before that meeting room fell silent, long before a stranger stood behind his chair and changed the direction of the night. There was Kang Min-jae. And to understand why his enemies underestimated him, you first have to understand the world he was born into. Kang Min-jae did not grow up around ordinary problems. From the moment he was old enough to remember faces, he understood that his family operated in shadows most people never see. Business meetings did not happen in bright offices. They happened in guarded rooms. Men who visited his father spoke in careful tones, measuring every word. Decisions made at the dinner table could influence entire districts of a city. Some of those decisions built fortunes. Others settled conflicts that never appeared in newspapers. Min-jae grew up watching all of it. Quietly. Carefully. While other children spent their days worrying about school grades and weekend plans, Min-jae was being taught lessons very few people ever learn. His father believed leadership required preparation. And preparation started early. By the age of 12, Min-jae had already begun attending certain private gatherings. Not as a participant, but as an observer. His father rarely explained what was happening. Instead, he would ask questions afterward. What did you notice? Who spoke first? Who stayed silent? Who controlled the room without raising their voice? Min-jae learned quickly that power rarely looked the way people imagined. It was not always loud. It was not always aggressive. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room was the one saying the least. Those lessons stayed with him. Through adolescence, through university, through the slow process of being introduced to the organization he would one day inherit. By his mid-20s, most members of the syndicate believed the transition was inevitable. Kang Min-jae was the future leader, not because he demanded it, but because he understood how the system worked. He was calm, reserved, the kind of man who listened longer than he spoke. Older members of the organization respected that. They believed he would grow into a careful and controlled leader. But plans like that rarely unfold smoothly. One night changed everything. The attack happened on a narrow street outside a private meeting. No warning, no negotiation. Just the sharp sound of gunfire breaking the quiet of the evening. Security responded immediately. The attackers disappeared before anyone could capture them. But the damage had already been done. When Min-jae was taken to the hospital, doctors worked for hours trying to stabilize his injuries. One of the bullets had struck dangerously close to his spine. The physical recovery would take months. The deeper consequences would last much longer. The surgery saved his life. But the damage to his spinal cord left him with permanent limitations. Walking became difficult. Standing for long periods became impossible. And eventually, the wheelchair became part of his daily life. Inside the organization, the reaction was immediate. Concern turned into uncertainty. Uncertainty slowly turned into doubt. For decades, leadership inside the syndicate had followed a simple pattern. Strength commanded loyalty. Strength created stability. Strength discouraged challenges. But now their future leader moved through the world differently. And in environments built on dominance, even small changes can alter perception. At first, people were careful, respectful, supportive, but behind closed doors, conversations started happening. Rival factions quietly measured the situation. Some believed the attack had solved their biggest obstacle. Others believed Min-jae would eventually step aside. A few simply waited, because time has a way of revealing weakness, or exposing it. Among younger members of the organization, a nickname began circulating, quietly at first, then more openly. They called him the Broken Heir. It was the kind of label that spreads quickly inside tight circles. Short, cruel, difficult to erase. And once a reputation like that forms, it begins influencing every interaction that follows. When Min-jae entered a room, people watched him differently. Some looked at the chair first. Others wondered how long he could hold control. And rivals started asking a dangerous question. If the heir appears vulnerable, who should replace him? But while others focused on his physical limitations, Min-jae was learning something else entirely. Something far more useful. He noticed how people behaved when they believed he was weak. They became careless. They spoke more freely. They stopped guarding their intentions. Ambition became easier to see. All the hidden calculations that once stayed buried under polite conversation began surfacing. Plans, alliances, resentment. Suddenly, everything was visible. The same injury that made people doubt him also made them underestimate him. And that gave Min-jae something extremely valuable. Time. Time to observe. Time to study the shifting loyalties inside his organization. Time to learn who truly respected him, and who was simply waiting for the right moment to move against him. So he stayed quiet. He allowed people to believe the rumors. He allowed rivals to grow comfortable. And slowly, carefully, he began mapping the real structure of power around him. Because Min-jae understood something many leaders forget. When people think you're weak, they stop watching carefully. They relax. They reveal their intentions. And eventually, they make mistakes. By the time Kang Min-jae officially stepped into leadership, he knew more about the ambitions of his rivals than they realized. But even with all that preparation, there was one situation he never expected. One moment that would shake his control more deeply than any rival ever could. Because the most painful blow to his reputation did not come from an enemy faction. It did not come from a rival boss. It came from someone much closer. Someone who knew exactly how fragile his position had become. The woman he planned to marry. The woman who was supposed to strengthen his leadership. Instead, she delivered the humiliation that nearly destroyed it. Power rarely collapses all at once. More often, it begins with a single moment. A moment when the people watching from the edges of the room suddenly realize something important has changed. For Kang Min-jae, that moment arrived during a dinner that was supposed to secure his future. The gathering had been carefully arranged weeks in advance. A private hall inside one of Seoul's most exclusive hotels. Long tables, crystal glasses, soft lighting designed to make everything appear calm, elegant, controlled. But everyone present understood the true purpose of the evening. This wasn't just dinner. It was a signal. A signal that two powerful families were preparing to join forces. For years, leaders within the organization had discussed the same solution. If Kang Min-jae's leadership was going to survive the growing doubts around him, he needed something powerful enough to silence criticism. A strategic marriage. His fiancée came from exactly the kind of family capable of delivering that stability. Her name was Seo Ji-yeon. Her father controlled an enormous business network that stretched far beyond the criminal world. Investments, shipping companies, real estate developments, political connections that reached deep into powerful circles. The kind of influence that could shield an organization during difficult times. A marriage between Kang Min-jae and Seo Ji-yeon would do more than unite two families. It would send a message. To rivals, to doubters, to anyone thinking about challenging his authority. It would say one simple thing. Min-jae was not alone. And that message mattered. Because inside the criminal world, alliances create protection. Protection discourages betrayal. That was the plan. And for a long time, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The engagement had been announced months earlier. Meetings between the families went smoothly. Even members of the organization who doubted Min-jae's physical condition believed the marriage would stabilize his leadership. But plans built on reputation can collapse quickly when perception changes. And Min-jae's condition had become harder to hide. In the months following his injury, his recovery had slowed. Standing became more difficult. Walking without assistance became rare. At first, Ji-yeon appeared supportive. She attended public events beside him. She smiled during family gatherings. She spoke politely about their future together. But people close to the situation would later reveal something important. Her patience had limits, and those limits were approaching quickly. The night of the dinner, everyone arrived expecting a simple announcement. Formal confirmation of the upcoming wedding. More photographs. More speeches about unity and tradition. Min-jae entered the hall quietly. Security positioned themselves along the walls. Senior members of both families took their seats. Business partners, advisors, and a few carefully selected allies filled the remaining chairs. The atmosphere felt controlled, respectful, exactly the way these gatherings were supposed to feel. Then Ji-yeon arrived, dressed elegantly, composed, confident. She greeted the elders first, her father second, and finally she turned toward Min-jae. Those watching closely noticed something subtle. She didn't smile. Dinner began normally. Conversations moved between business deals and polite family stories. Wine was poured. Toasts were raised. But eventually the moment everyone expected arrived. Ji-Yun's father stood first. He spoke about partnership, about tradition, about the future both families would build together. Applause followed. Then Ji-Yun stood. People assumed she would say something simple. Perhaps thank the families for their support. Perhaps talk about the responsibilities she would carry as Min-jae's wife. Instead, she took a long breath and said something no one expected. I think it's important to be honest tonight. The room grew quieter. Min-jae looked up at her. Ji-Yun continued. I have thought carefully about this engagement. Her father shifted slightly in his chair. Something about her tone felt wrong. This marriage, she said slowly, was arranged for the benefit of both families. Several guests nodded. That much was obvious. But then her voice hardened. And for a while, I believed it was the right decision. Now people were paying closer attention. Ji-Yun turned toward Min-jae. Her eyes dropped briefly to the wheelchair, then back to his face.
You are not
But
enough for me.
circumstances changed.
This is my time to
Few
shine.
guests
I
exchanged
kept you.
uneasy glances. Min-jae said nothing. He simply watched her. Ji-Yun straightened her posture and delivered the sentence that would echo through the organization within hours. I cannot marry a man who cannot stand on his own. The words landed like a shockwave. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff froze beside the walls. Min-jae's advisors stared at the table. Her father looked completely stunned. Because what Ji-Yun had just done wasn't simply breaking an engagement. She had done it publicly. In front of elders. In front of allies. In front of men who carried information back to every corner of the organization. Min-jae remained still. His expression barely changed. But the damage had already been done. Ji-Yun continued, as if explaining something obvious. Our families deserve stability, she said. And stability requires strength. She paused, then delivered the final blow. I refuse to build my future on uncertainty. The silence in the room grew heavier. No one challenged her. No one interrupted, because everyone understood what this meant. By the time the dinner ended, the story was already spreading. Phone calls moved through the city. Messages passed between rival factions. Within hours, every major figure inside the criminal network knew what had happened. Kang Min-jae's fiancée had rejected him. Publicly. Cruelly. And in doing so, she had confirmed the doubts many people already carried. The consequences appeared almost immediately. Rival bosses began questioning his leadership. Investors connected to the organization quietly paused their commitments. Even longtime allies started keeping their distance. Not out of hatred, but out of caution. Because inside a world built on power, no one wants to stand too close to a leader whose authority is weakening. For the first time since inheriting control of the organization, Kang Min-jae found himself standing on unstable ground. The carefully planned marriage had been his strongest political protection. Now it was gone, and the message sent by Ji-Yun's rejection had made the situation even worse. The broken air. The nickname returned, only louder this time, more confident, more dangerous. But as the days passed and the pressure around him continued to grow, Min-jae reached a realization that forced him to act quickly. Without a powerful alliance through marriage, his enemies would continue testing his authority, and eventually someone would try to remove him completely, which meant he had two options: surrender control of the organization, or create a new alliance fast enough to shock everyone watching. That was when Kang Min-jae made a decision that stunned even the people closest to him. A decision no one inside the criminal world could understand at first. He would still get married, but not to a powerful heiress, not to someone from another syndicate family. Instead, he chose someone no one in his world had ever heard of, and that single decision would change everything that followed. At the exact moment Kong Min-jae's reputation was beginning to fracture inside his own organization, a woman across the city was focused on a far simpler question: how to survive another week. Her name was Amara Johnson, and unlike the people seated in private boardrooms discussing power and loyalty, Amara's world had become painfully small. A car, a phone with a fading battery, a stack of unanswered job applications, and the constant calculation of how long she could stretch the few dollars left in her account. But her story had not started this way. Amara had arrived in South Korea several years earlier with something many people believed would guarantee success: education, determination, and a plan. She had studied international business, working long hours while supporting two younger siblings back home who depended on her help. Her professors described her as focused, disciplined, the kind of student who asked difficult questions and refused to settle for easy answers. When she graduated, she believed she was ready to build a stable life. For a while, it looked like she had. Her first job came quickly: a mid-sized logistics company that handled international shipping contracts. The work was demanding, but it paid enough for a small apartment and regular money transfers to her family. Every month, she sent part of her salary home. Every month, her siblings reminded her that she was the reason they could stay in school. For a while, things felt stable, predictable, manageable. Then the company lost a major contract. Layoffs began quietly. Departments shrank. Temporary workers were dismissed first. Then full-time employees started receiving short emails from human resources asking them to come in for private meetings. Amara's meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. The explanation was brief: budget cuts, restructuring, nothing personal. By the time she walked out of the building, the security card in her pocket had already been deactivated. At first, she believed it would only be a temporary setback. She updated her resume, sent out dozens of applications, called former colleagues, attended interviews that always ended with polite smiles and careful excuses. Weeks passed, then months. Her savings disappeared slowly. First the comfortable expenses, then the small comforts, then the things she had assumed were permanent. The apartment came next. Packing her belongings into boxes was the moment the situation finally felt real. The landlord wasn't cruel about it, just practical. Rent had to be paid. When it wasn't, tenants had to leave. Amara moved her remaining belongings into the only space she still controlled: her car. At first, she told herself it was temporary. A few nights, maybe a week, just until one of the applications turned into an offer. But time has a way of stretching when money disappears. Soon she developed routines. During the day, she parked near libraries or public buildings with internet access. She sent more applications, edited cover letters, studied job listings late into the night. At night, she moved the car to quiet parking lots where security guards rarely checked. Sometimes outside grocery stores, sometimes near office buildings where no one noticed another parked vehicle. Sleeping in a car changes the way people move through the world. Every sound matters, every passing headlight, every knock on the window. But Amara refused to let the situation break her. She woke early, kept her clothes clean using public laundromats, maintained the appearance of someone who still belonged in professional spaces. If you saw her walking into an office building with her laptop bag, you would never guess where she slept the night before. And despite everything pressing against her, she refused one thing: pity. She never called home asking for help. Her siblings believed she was still living comfortably, still working, still sending money. She protected that illusion carefully, because pride can be powerful, even when it comes at a cost. People who met Amara during that period often remembered the same details. She didn't complain. She didn't explain her situation. She simply kept moving forward, observing, adapting, waiting for the moment things might change. And while the world around Kong Min-jae was filled with strategy and quiet threats, Amara was developing her own kind of awareness. When survival becomes your daily focus, you begin noticing details other people overlook. Conversations in waiting rooms, arguments between managers and employees, the way certain people speak when they think no one important is listening. These observations slowly sharpen instincts, and those instincts would eventually place her in the path of someone whose life was moving in a completely different direction. Because while Amara was studying job listings in the corner of public libraries, Kong Min-jae was studying the shifting loyalties inside a criminal empire. Neither of them knew the other existed, yet their paths were moving closer with every passing day. And when their worlds finally crossed, it wouldn't happen in a dramatic moment filled with music or romance. There would be no sudden declaration, no emotional confession. Their first real conversation would begin with something far colder. A proposal, not for love, not for companionship, but for something far more practical. Because when Kong Min-jae finally approached Amara Johnson, he wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a solution. And what began between them that day was not a love story. It was a negotiation. Some encounters look ordinary in the moment. Two strangers crossing the same room. A short exchange of words. A brief disagreement between employees and management. Nothing that would normally attract attention. But sometimes, those quiet moments redirect entire lives. The first time Kong Min-jae noticed Amara Johnson, she wasn't trying to be noticed at all. It happened inside the lobby of a luxury hotel in central Seoul. A place designed for quiet business meetings and wealthy travelers who preferred privacy over crowds. Min-jae had arrived for a discussion with several international partners connected to one of the organization's legitimate businesses. On paper, it was a shipping investment meeting. In reality, conversations like this often served several purposes at once: business, observation, and quiet negotiations that rarely appeared in official records. Min-jae moved through the lobby with his security team, the sound of polished shoes echoing softly across the marble floor. Staff members bowed politely as he passed. Most guests barely glanced in his direction. But as his chair moved past the reception desk, a raised voice interrupted the calm atmosphere. A hotel manager stood across the counter, speaking sharply to someone on the other side. "That's not possible," the manager said, his tone firm and dismissive. "You can't stay here without payment." Min-jae would normally have ignored the situation. Disagreements between staff and guests happened constantly in places like this. But something about the response he heard next made him pause. The voice was calm, not defensive, not emotional, just steady. "I'm not asking for a room tonight," the woman replied. "I'm asking for the refund your company promised 2 weeks ago." Min-jae glanced toward the desk. The woman standing there looked exhausted, but composed. Her clothes were simple but clean. A laptop bag rested beside her on the counter. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or influence. But the way she held herself suggested something else. Confidence. The manager crossed his arms. "You were already told the refund request is under review." Amara didn't raise her voice. She simply opened a folder and placed several printed emails on the counter. "These messages confirm the refund was approved," she said. "Your accounting department sent them directly." The manager looked irritated now. "That doesn't mean the money is available immediately." Amara nodded slightly. "I understand delays." She tapped the email with her finger. "But your department promised payment within 5 business days." Her tone remained measured, controlled. "If the hotel cannot honor that commitment," she continued, "I'll need the name of the person responsible for financial approvals." The manager frowned. "Why?" "So I know who to include in the formal complaint." Several people in the lobby had begun quietly watching the exchange. The manager leaned forward slightly. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." Amara didn't move, didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply met his eyes. "I'm asking for what your company already agreed to." Her voice never changed. No frustration, no desperation, just clarity. From across the lobby, Kong Min-jae watched the entire exchange without interrupting. At first glance, it was a minor disagreement. But what caught his attention wasn't the argument itself. It was her composure. Most people facing financial pressure show it immediately. Their voices tighten. Their posture collapses. They apologize more than necessary. Amara did none of those things. Even though the situation clearly mattered to her, she refused to appear desperate. That detail stayed in Min-jae's mind long after his meeting upstairs had ended. Later that evening, while reviewing the growing challenges inside his organization, one of his advisors raised an idea that initially sounded absurd. The advisor's name was Han, a strategist who had served the Kong family for years. Han had watched the fallout from Ji-eun's rejection closely. He understood how dangerous the situation had become. "You need a marriage," Han said quietly during their private meeting. Min-jae didn't respond immediately. Han continued. "Not for romance," he added. "For strategy." Min-jae looked up. Han explained his reasoning carefully. A sudden marriage could disrupt the plans forming against him. It would force rival factions to pause and reconsider their moves. It would create confusion. Confusion buys time, and time allows strategy to unfold. Min-jae listened without interruption. "Who?" he finally asked. Han hesitated. "Not someone powerful." Min-jae raised an eyebrow. Han leaned forward. "Someone unexpected." The idea sounded strange, but the more they discussed it, the more sense it began to make. If Min-jae married into another powerful family, rivals would simply analyze the alliance and adjust their plans. But if he married someone completely outside the criminal world, someone no one understood, it would disrupt every calculation. Min-jae thought back to the woman in the hotel lobby. The way she refused to show weakness. The way she handled pressure without hesitation. "Find her," he said. Within hours, his security team had identified her. Amara Johnson. Temporary visa status. Unemployed. Financial difficulties. No criminal record. No political connections. Nothing linking her to the world Kong Min-jae controlled. A few days later, she received an invitation to return to the same hotel. The message was brief. A private meeting. Professional opportunity. Amara almost ignored it. Opportunities that arrive without explanation often come with hidden problems. But curiosity eventually pushed her to accept. When she entered the hotel's private conference room that afternoon, she expected a standard interview. What she found instead was Kong Min-jae, seated at the center of a long table. Several advisors positioned along the walls. Security near the door. The atmosphere immediately felt unusual. Min-jae spoke first. "I saw you in the lobby last week." Amara blinked, surprised. "The refund situation?" He nodded. "You handled it well." She waited for him to explain the purpose of the meeting. Instead, he asked her a series of quiet questions. About her education, her work experience, her current situation. Amara answered carefully. Then Min-jae leaned forward slightly. "What I'm about to propose," he said, "will sound unusual." Amara remained silent. "I need to get married." The words hung in the air. For a moment she assumed she had misunderstood. Then he continued. "A contract marriage. 1 year. Financial compensation large enough to solve her immediate problems. Housing. Security. Stability." Amara stared at him, waiting for the explanation that would make the offer logical. It never came. Instead, Min-jae described the arrangement as calmly as if discussing a business contract. Public appearances together. shared residence, complete financial support. At the end of 1 year, the agreement would end. No further obligation. Amara leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "This is serious?" she asked. "Yes. And the risks?" Minjae paused. "There are some." He didn't elaborate. Amara considered the situation. Everything about it sounded dangerous, strange, uncomfortable. Yet the alternative was returning to the car she slept in each night, returning to the endless search for work that never came. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most. "Why me?" Minjae answered without hesitation. "Because you didn't look at me like I'm broken." The room fell quiet again. For the first time since entering the meeting, Amara understood something important. This offer had nothing to do with convenience. Minjae had been watching her, evaluating her, and somehow he believed she could serve a purpose inside a world she barely understood. After a long silence, Amara nodded slowly. "I'll do it." None of them realized how much that simple agreement would change the future, because the contract they had just formed was about to trigger a conflict far larger than either of them expected. A conflict that would pull Amara Johnson directly into the center of a criminal empire and transform her from an unknown outsider into the most dangerous ally Kong Minjae would ever have. The announcement traveled faster than anyone expected. By the time the sun rose the next morning, leaders across the criminal network were already discussing it. Phones rang inside private offices. Encrypted messages moved between trusted lieutenants. Closed-door meetings appeared on calendars that had been empty the night before. Kong Minjae had married, but the identity of his wife shocked nearly everyone who heard the news. Not the daughter of a powerful ally, not a political connection, not a woman raised within the quiet rules of the organization. A stranger, a woman from outside their entire world. And for men who had spent their lives calculating alliances and influence, the decision made no sense. Inside this kind of environment, marriages were never just personal commitments. They were tools, strategic bonds designed to strengthen loyalty and prevent internal conflict. When Minjae's engagement to Seo Ji-eun collapsed, many believed his leadership had lost its strongest protection. His sudden marriage to an unknown woman seemed to confirm their doubts. Several senior figures reacted with immediate anger. "This is reckless," one faction leader reportedly told his advisors. Another called it an insult to tradition. Others were less emotional, but far more calculating. If Minjae had truly weakened his position with this decision, the moment to challenge him might be approaching. Within days, the atmosphere inside the organization changed. Respectful greetings became shorter. Meetings became colder. People who once stood close to Minjae during gatherings now positioned themselves a few steps farther away. Nothing dramatic, just small signals. But in a world built on observation, small signals matter. And then the pressure escalated. Quiet tests of authority began appearing. A shipment that should have moved smoothly was suddenly delayed by one of the regional captains. A financial transfer connected to the organization's business network was temporarily frozen by an ally who claimed there had been confusion. Requests that once received immediate approval now faced unexpected questions. Each incident was minor on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Rivals were probing for weakness, waiting to see how Minjae would respond. And as the tension grew inside the organization, something else began happening as well. Threats returned. The assassination attempt years earlier had nearly ended Minjae's life. After that attack, security around him had increased dramatically. For a while, the attempt stopped. But power struggles rarely stay quiet forever. Now, with doubts spreading again, dangerous individuals started reconsidering their options. Security teams noticed unusual activity near several properties connected to the Kong family. Vehicles parked too long outside certain buildings. Unknown individuals asking questions about travel schedules. Nothing concrete enough to trigger immediate retaliation, but enough to raise alarms. Inside this tightening atmosphere, Amara Johnson found herself standing in the center of a world she had never imagined entering. Just weeks earlier, she had been sleeping inside her car. Now she lived inside a secured residence monitored by professional guards. Her daily routine changed completely. Security teams escorted her whenever she left the house. Meetings happened in guarded rooms where every conversation was measured carefully. Men who carried themselves with quiet authority entered and exited the building at all hours. Some of them looked at her with curiosity. Others looked at her with open skepticism. A few barely acknowledged her presence at all. To them, she represented a mistake, an impulsive decision by a leader already facing criticism. But Amara reacted to the situation differently than most people expected. She didn't try to prove herself. She didn't argue with the people who doubted her. Instead, she watched, carefully. The same habits that had helped her survive months of uncertainty were now guiding her inside this unfamiliar environment. Observation, patience, listening before speaking. Meetings inside the organization followed certain rhythms. Some members spoke loudly, trying to establish authority. Others remained quiet but attentive. Amara noticed something quickly. The people who talked the most rarely controlled the room. The real decisions often formed in smaller conversations after the official meeting had ended. She also began noticing patterns in behavior. Who avoided eye contact when certain topics were discussed, who interrupted others, who asked careful questions, and who remained silent when they should have spoken. These details may have seemed insignificant to someone unfamiliar with power structures, but to Amara they told stories. Stories about loyalty, about ambition, about fear. At first, she kept those observations to herself. Her role in the contract marriage had never included strategic advice. But one evening, during a quiet dinner inside the residence, she mentioned something casually. "You trust Director Cho too much." Min-jae looked up from his documents. "Why do you think that?" Amara shrugged slightly. "He doesn't disagree with you during meetings." Min-jae studied her. "That's not unusual." "True," she said. But when Captain Lee questioned the warehouse expansion plan, Cho stayed quiet. And Amara leaned back. "He's been meeting privately with Lee afterward." Min-jae's expression shifted slightly. "How do you know?" "They both leave the building around the same time after meetings," she replied calmly. "They take the same elevator." Min-jae didn't answer immediately. Instead, he made a note. 2 weeks later, an internal investigation revealed something important. Director Cho had been quietly negotiating with a rival faction. Not a full betrayal yet, but a negotiation that could have grown dangerous if left unnoticed. From that point forward, Min-jae began paying closer attention when Amara spoke, and she continued observing. Small details, quiet signals, shifts in tone during conversations. Gradually, her insights began forming a clearer picture of the tensions inside the organization. Min-jae started asking for her opinion after certain meetings. At first privately, later more openly. Some advisors resisted the idea. A few openly criticized it. But results are difficult to argue with. Several potential betrayals were identified earlier than expected. A financial manipulation attempt was uncovered before it could damage the organization's accounts, and an internal power move planned by 2 mid-level captains collapsed before it reached the final stage. Each time, Amara had noticed something subtle, a hesitation, an inconsistency, a moment that didn't align with the story being told. The same men who once dismissed her presence began watching her more carefully. Not with respect yet, but with caution, because the outsider they mocked as a desperate woman chasing financial security. was beginning to influence decisions inside the organization. And while rivals continued believing Kang Min-jae had made a foolish marriage, they were overlooking something important. The woman standing beside him was not simply adapting to the world she had entered. She was learning it, studying it, understanding it faster than anyone expected. And slowly, quietly, she was becoming the advantage none of his enemies had anticipated. The woman they once mocked as a mistake was turning into Kang Min-jae's most valuable ally. The first sign that something had changed was subtle. At the beginning, Amara Johnson was simply present, a quiet figure at the edge of conversations, someone the organization tolerated but did not fully acknowledge. But weeks passed, then months, and the pattern began to shift. Not dramatically, not with loud declarations or public recognition. Instead, it happened the way influence often develops inside powerful organizations. Gradually, through small decisions, through quiet observations that proved accurate, through moments when someone noticed something others had overlooked. At first, Amara spent most of her time listening. Meetings inside Kang Min-jae's organization followed an established structure. Regional captains reported on territory activity. Financial advisors summarized business movements. Security leaders discussed emerging threats. Most of the men speaking in those rooms had spent years inside this environment. They knew the language. They understood the hierarchy. They believed they understood the game. Amara had none of that experience. But she had something else. Perspective from outside the system. And sometimes, that perspective sees details insiders stop noticing. She began studying the structure of the organization the way someone studies a complex puzzle. Which captains controlled which territories, which families had long histories with the Kang Syndicate, which alliances were built on loyalty, and which were built on convenience. Min-jae did not formally assign her this role. There were no official titles, no public announcements, but he noticed something early. When Amara asked questions, they were rarely casual. They were precise. Why does Captain Seo report directly to Director Cho instead of through the regional chain? Why does the Busan faction send 2 representatives to meetings when the others only send 1? Why did Chairman Park push so hard for the warehouse contract last month? Each question forced people in the room to think more carefully about their answers. Sometimes the explanations were simple. Sometimes they revealed tensions no one had openly discussed. Min-jae began testing something quietly. After certain meetings, he would ask her opinion. At first, just a single question. What did you notice? Amara never rushed her responses. She took time, thinking, replaying the conversations in her mind. Eventually, she began offering insights that changed how Min-jae viewed the situation around him. She noticed how certain captains supported proposals only when specific advisors spoke first. She noticed which members avoided making commitments during tense discussions. She noticed the patterns of loyalty shifting beneath the surface. Slowly, Min-jae stopped thinking of her as someone temporarily sharing his residence. He began seeing her as something else, an observer with a rare ability to read people. Someone whose distance from the organization actually made her perspective clearer. Their conversations grew longer, more strategic, sometimes lasting late into the night inside the quiet office overlooking the city. Amara asked questions. Min-jae explained the history behind certain alliances, the past conflicts that shaped the current leadership, the unwritten rules that govern the organization's decisions. She absorbed everything, and over time, her instincts sharpened, which is why the moment that changed everything almost passed unnoticed. It happened during a routine strategy meeting. Nothing about the agenda suggested urgency. Regional reports, financial summaries, discussion about expanding shipping operations along the southern ports. Among the attendees was a man named Chairman Lee, a rival leader who controlled a significant network of operations near Busan. For months, Lee had been pushing for a new agreement, a partnership that would allow his faction to share certain routes controlled by Min Jae's organization. Officially, the negotiations were still ongoing. Publicly, Lee presented himself as cooperative, respectful, interested in strengthening the relationship between their groups. During the meeting, he repeated those same assurances. "We should work together," Lee said calmly. "Our interests are aligned." Most of the room treated the conversation as routine. Negotiations between factions often took months. But Amara noticed something. Not in Lee's words. In his timing. He had attended 3 meetings in the past 2 months. Each time he repeated the same argument. Each time he avoided committing to specific terms. And each time, he brought a slightly larger security detail. Not inside the meeting room, but waiting outside the building. That detail stayed in Amara's mind long after the discussion ended. Later that evening, she approached Min Jae in his office. "You're not negotiating with Lee," she said. Min Jae looked up from his desk. "We've been negotiating for weeks." She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "He's measuring you." Min Jae leaned back in his chair. "Explain." Amara walked to the window, thinking carefully before speaking. "He keeps repeating the same offer." "That's negotiation," Min Jae replied. "Not if he never adjusts the terms," she said. Min Jae waited. Amara continued. "He's studying the responses in the room, watching who supports you, watching who hesitates. And every time he comes here, he brings more security." Min Jae's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's not planning an agreement," Amara said quietly. "He's planning something else." The room fell silent. Min Jae studied her for several seconds. "A challenge?" he asked. "Something bigger," she replied. "A takeover." The word hung in the air. If she was right, Chairman Lee wasn't negotiating. He was preparing a coordinated move to replace Min Jae entirely. Min Jae didn't dismiss the idea. Instead, he asked the most important question. "What would you do?" Amara didn't answer immediately. She walked back toward the table where several documents lay open. Then she pointed to a map showing the organization's shipping routes. "You let him believe the plan is working," she said. Min Jae leaned forward slightly. "And then, you give him the moment he's waiting for." Min Jae's expression changed. For the first time since the conversation began, a faint smile appeared. Because what Amara had just suggested wasn't defense. It was a trap. If Chairman Lee truly believed Min Jae was weak, he would eventually reveal his full plan. And when he did, every ally supporting him would become visible. Min Jae closed the folder in front of him slowly. "Prepare the meeting," he said. Amara nodded. Neither of them spoke for several seconds, because both understood what this meant. If her instincts were correct, the organization was about to face its most dangerous challenge since the assassination attempt years earlier. But this time, Kang Min Jae wouldn't be reacting to the attack. He would be waiting for it. And beside him, the woman once dismissed as a desperate outsider, was now helping design the trap. The room had already been arranged before anyone arrived. A long table, 10 chairs, carefully spaced, each one representing a man whose decisions could reshape entire districts of the city. But the real purpose of the meeting was hidden behind formal invitations and polite language. Officially, it was called a strategic discussion. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. A test. A moment where power would quietly change hands, or collapse completely. By the time the first black sedans began arriving outside the building, Kang Min Jae's security teams were already positioned throughout the property. Guards stood near the entrance. Others monitored the hallways. No one entering the room noticed anything unusual. Everything looked exactly the way these meetings always looked. Controlled, professional, routine. But inside Min Jae's office, Just hours earlier, a very different conversation had taken place. Amara Johnson sat across from him, reviewing the final reports. Not financial reports. Not territory updates. Evidence. Months of observation had produced something powerful. Patterns. Hidden agreements. Quiet movements between factions. And now those pieces had been assembled into a clear picture. Chairman Lee had not been negotiating. He had been preparing a coordinated challenge designed to remove Kong Min-jae from leadership. But Lee had made one critical mistake. He assumed the leader he was targeting would never see it coming. He assumed the man in the wheelchair was too distracted, too isolated, too weakened by internal pressure to notice the slow alignment forming around him. What Lee never realized was that someone else had been watching the room. Someone who noticed every hesitation, every careful glance between allies, every conversation that ended too quickly when certain people walked past. Amara closed the final folder that morning and looked at Min-jae. "They're ready," she said. Min-jae nodded once. Good. Neither of them spoke after that, because the plan no longer required discussion. Everything was already in motion. And now, the room where it would unfold was filling with people who believed they were about to witness the end of Kong Min-jae's leadership. One by one, the chairs around the table filled. Senior captains, financial directors, regional leaders. Among them sat Chairman Park, the same man who had openly mocked Min-jae earlier, the same man who believed weakness had finally created an opportunity. Park leaned comfortably in his chair, watching the door. He had spent the last 2 weeks quietly strengthening his alliances. Captain Lee, Director Cho, several mid-level commanders who believed the organization needed stronger leadership. Tonight, Park believed the balance would finally shift. When Kong Min-jae entered the room, conversations quieted immediately. The wheelchair rolled smoothly toward the head of the table. Security guards closed the door behind him. Park smiled, not politely, but confidently, the same confidence that had filled the room during their previous confrontation. "Chairman Kong," Park said slowly, "you've called another meeting." Min-jae rested his hands lightly on the table. "Yes." Park leaned forward. "About what?" Min-jae glanced around the room, studying each face carefully. Some showed curiosity. Others showed impatience. A few avoided eye contact entirely. And standing quietly behind his chair was Amara, still, observing, exactly the way she had done since the first day she entered this world. Park broke the silence again. "You know," he said with a faint laugh, "many people are wondering how long this arrangement will last." His eyes flicked briefly toward Amara. "Your marriage." Several men exchanged glances. Park continued. "A leader under pressure marrying a stranger." He shook his head slowly. "Interesting strategy." Min-jae said nothing. The silence encouraged Park further. "Tell us honestly," Park said. "Do you believe that decision strengthened your position?" The room grew quieter. Everyone understood the challenge hidden inside the question. Park leaned back. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the organization is losing confidence." Still, Min-jae didn't respond. Park's smile widened slightly. He believed the moment had arrived. "You may not want to hear this," Park continued, "but leadership requires more than patience." His gaze dropped briefly toward the wheelchair. "It requires strength." A few men shifted uncomfortably. Others watched carefully. Park raised his voice slightly. "And if you cannot provide that strength, perhaps it's time for someone else to step forward." The statement hung in the air. An open challenge. Exactly what Chairman Lee had been preparing for. Exactly what Park believed his allies in the room would soon support. But before anyone else could speak, Amara stepped forward. Just one step. The movement caught several people off guard. Park frowned. "This meeting is for members of the council," he said sharply. Amara didn't raise her voice. She simply placed a folder on the table, directly in front of him. "You should read this first," she said. Park laughed quietly. "I'm not interested in Chairman Lee's offshore accounts," she said calmly. Park stopped speaking. The room froze. Amara opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed records, financial transfers, shipping manifests, encrypted communications that had been decoded over weeks of quiet investigation. She turned the first page toward him. "These transactions began 6 months ago." Park's smile disappeared. "Funding private security units," she continued. "Units that do not report to the organization." Several men leaned forward, trying to see the documents from across the table. Amara flipped another page. "This one is more interesting." Park's fingers tightened slightly against the table. "Payments to 3 regional captains." She looked up. "The same captains who planned to support your leadership challenge tonight." The silence inside the room became heavier than before. Park glanced around quickly. Some of the men he expected to support him were staring at the documents now. Others were staring at him. Amara continued calmly. "There's also something else." She placed a final sheet on the table. An internal message from Director Cho. Park's face hardened. Amara spoke slowly. "He promised to secure half the council votes after tonight's meeting." One of the men near the end of the table pushed his chair back slightly. The tension in the room had shifted completely. Park opened the folder, scanning the pages quickly. His expression changed with each document. "How did you get this?" he demanded. Amara didn't answer. Instead, Kong Min-jae finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but every word carried across the room. "You asked earlier whether my decisions strengthen my position." Park looked up. Min-jae gestured toward the documents. "These men believed I was too weak to notice what they were planning." He paused, and that assumption revealed everything. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different, because now the truth was visible to everyone present. Chairman Park's challenge had just collapsed. Chairman Lee's plan had been exposed, and every hidden alliance supporting them was suddenly standing in the open. The balance of power had shifted in seconds. The man many believed was losing control was now holding every advantage, and standing behind him, the woman they once mocked as a reckless mistake was no longer an outsider. She was the one who had seen the entire plan before it could unfold, the architect of the trap, the strategist who had turned observation into victory. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood something they should have realized much earlier. Kong Min-jae had never been alone, and the woman beside him had just changed the future of the entire organization. Power struggles rarely end with a single meeting. Even when the truth is exposed, even when alliances collapse in front of witnesses, the consequences take time to settle. But in the months that followed that night, something unusual happened inside Kong Min-jae's organization. The noise faded, the arguments stopped, and the quiet tension that had once filled every meeting slowly disappeared. The men who had secretly aligned themselves with Chairman Lee understood that the plan had failed long before it could take shape. Some stepped back from their ambitions. Others disappeared from leadership entirely. A few attempted to rebuild their loyalty through silence and obedience. But the most important result was simpler. No one questioned Kong Min-jae's leadership anymore. Not publicly, not privately, because the same man many had once dismissed as the broken heir had just demonstrated something far more powerful than physical strength. Patience, awareness, and the ability to let his enemies reveal themselves. The trap had worked perfectly, and everyone knew who had designed it. Inside the organization, Amara Johnson's presence was no longer a curiosity, no longer an inconvenience, no longer a mistake. When she entered a room now, conversations paused. People listened more carefully when she spoke. Some even sought her opinion before presenting proposals to Min-jae. But outside those rooms, something more complicated had begun to change. The contract that had brought them together was quietly approaching its end. 1 year. That had been the agreement from the beginning. 1 year of public appearances. 1 year of shared space. 1 year of playing the role of husband and wife inside a world that required the illusion. After that, both of them would walk away. That was the arrangement. Simple, clear, practical, and for months, neither of them questioned it. But time has a way of altering arrangements people once believed were temporary. Because somewhere between late-night strategy discussions and quiet dinners after difficult meetings, something else had developed between them. Not the kind of relationship people expect from romantic stories. Something quieter than that. Respect. Trust. The understanding that two very different people had survived the same storm by standing beside each other. One evening, nearly 11 months after their marriage began, the city outside their residence was unusually calm. From the balcony, the skyline stretched across the distance in a line of quiet lights. Inside the office, Kong Min-jae sat reviewing the final reports from the organization's regional captains. Everything looked stable. Territories were secure. Financial operations had recovered. The internal tensions that once threatened to fracture the syndicate had finally settled. The crisis that began with humiliation and doubt had ended with control restored. Across the room, Amara closed the last folder on the desk. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They both understood what the silence meant. The contract was almost finished. Amara had more than enough money now to rebuild her life. More than she had ever imagined earning when she first agreed to the arrangement. She could return to the career she once pursued. Start a business. Travel. Choose a future that no longer depended on survival alone. Min-jae looked up from his desk. "You're free to leave whenever you want," he said calmly. Amara studied him for a moment. The words were expected. They had always been part of the agreement, but hearing them now felt different. "Everything we promised you will still be honored," Min-jae continued. "The house, the financial settlement, the documents allowing you to remain here if you choose." He paused slightly. "You don't owe this organization anything." Amara walked slowly toward the window, looking out across the city lights. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she turned back toward him. "Can I ask you something?" Min-jae nodded. She studied his expression carefully before speaking. "Was this always part of your plan?" He didn't answer immediately. The question was simple, but the meaning behind it carried weight. Amara continued quietly. "When you asked me to marry you, did you already know everything would unfold like this? The betrayals, the trap, the meeting, the way everything ended." Min-jae leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time in a long while, he looked genuinely thoughtful. Then he shook his head. "No." The answer came quietly. Honest. Direct. "I had plans," he admitted, "but none of them looked like this." He folded his hands on the desk. "When you walked into that hotel conference room, I was trying to solve one problem. Survival." His eyes moved toward the city outside the window. "The organization was turning against me. Rivals were preparing to move. I needed time." He paused. "And you gave me that." Amara listened carefully. Min-jae continued. "But everything else." He gestured lightly toward the room around them. "The strategy, the insights, the things you noticed before anyone else." He shook his head again. "I didn't expect any of that." For a moment the room was completely quiet. Then he said something he rarely admitted to anyone. "I never expected to find someone who could actually stand beside me." Amara held his gaze. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them tried to explain what that statement meant, because both of them understood it already. What began as a transaction had become something far more complicated and far more real. History often remembers the powerful, the feared, the untouchable figures who sat at the top of empires built on loyalty, silence, and control. But every so often, history takes a different path, and the story it leaves behind is far more unexpected. Because sometimes, the people who change everything are the ones no one believed in to begin with. For months, the criminal world had been watching a leader they once respected make what they believed was the worst decision of his life. A powerful syndicate boss, choosing to marry a woman with no connections, no family influence, no political leverage, no place in the ruthless hierarchy of organized power. To them, it was a mistake, a dangerous one, inside hidden meeting rooms, behind closed doors where alliances were quietly traded and broken. The whispers began. They said he had grown soft. They said loneliness had clouded his judgment. They said his enemies would take advantage of it. And for a while, it looked like they might be right. The threats returned. Old rivals began testing his authority again. Assassination attempts resurfaced. Longtime allies started questioning their loyalty. The marriage that was supposed to secure his future seemed to place everything at risk. But what none of them realized was that the quiet woman standing beside him was watching everything. Amara had entered the marriage for survival, a contract, a financial escape from a life that had offered her very few options. At first, she had simply tried to stay invisible, to avoid drawing attention, to avoid making mistakes in a world that could destroy someone in an instant. But survival has a way of sharpening the mind. And slowly, Amara began noticing things, patterns, small details others ignored, conversations that seemed harmless on the surface, but carried deeper meaning. She listened. She studied people. She paid attention to body language, to hesitation, to the way certain names were mentioned in certain rooms. And over time, something remarkable happened. The outsider everyone dismissed began understanding the organization better than many of the men who had been inside it for years. Minjae noticed first. At the beginning, it was small, a quiet observation, a simple question, a comment about someone whose loyalty seemed uncertain. He didn't always act on her suggestions, but he remembered them. And when those observations proved correct, again and again and again, the dynamic between them began to shift. She was no longer simply the woman who had married him. She was someone who could see what others missed. Someone who noticed the cracks forming before they widened. Someone who could quietly change the outcome of decisions that determined the future of an entire syndicate. Then came the moment that changed everything. A rival leader believed he had finally found the weakness he'd been waiting for. He believed the marriage had divided the organization. He believed Minjae's authority had eroded just enough for a takeover to succeed. What he didn't know was that the entire plan had already been uncovered, because Amara had seen the pattern weeks earlier. The hidden financial transfers, the unusual meetings, the sudden change in behavior among certain members. She pieced it together before anyone else realized what was happening. And when the final confrontation arrived, the evidence she revealed dismantled the plot in seconds. The room shifted, power shifted, and the man they once believed had made a foolish decision stood firmly in control. But the greater surprise wasn't the outcome of that meeting. It was the realization that followed, because the woman who had walked into their world as a stranger was now one of the most important minds inside it. Months passed. The chaos faded. The organization stabilized once again. Old loyalties were restored. New ones were formed. And the criminal empire Minjae led became stronger than it had been before the crisis. Yet one question remained between the two people at the center of it all. Their marriage had always been temporary. A contract. An arrangement built on mutual benefit. Amara had fulfilled her side of the agreement. She had earned enough to build a new life, one far away from the danger that surrounded Minjae's world. And when the time came, He offered her exactly what they had originally promised each other. Freedom. No pressure. No expectations. Just a simple choice. She could leave. Start over. Disappear from the dangerous network she had helped save. But before making that decision, Amara asked him something. A single question. One that had been quietly sitting in her mind for months. Was this always part of your plan? For a moment, Minjae said nothing. A man known for control, for strategy, for always thinking several moves ahead. And yet, this was the one thing he hadn't planned. Finally, he answered honestly. No, there had never been a grand design. No master strategy that predicted how everything would unfold. At the beginning, he had only been trying to survive, to protect his position, to navigate a world where weakness invited destruction. The marriage had been nothing more than a calculated decision in a desperate moment. But somewhere along the way, that calculation changed. Because what he discovered wasn't just an ally, and it wasn't just a strategist. He found someone who could stand beside him in a world where very few people could. Someone who saw the dangers clearly, and stayed anyway. And that was something even the most careful strategist could never fully plan for. In the end, the story that spread across the criminal underworld wasn't about betrayal or power struggles. It was about something far more unexpected. A man once rejected by those who believed they were stronger. A woman who had spent most of her life being overlooked. Two people the world had quietly dismissed. And yet, when their paths crossed, they changed the balance of power in ways no one saw coming. Sometimes the greatest shifts in history begin in the most unlikely places. Not inside grand strategies. Not within carefully arranged alliances. But in moments when two underestimated lives intersect. And refuse to follow the limits the world placed on them. Because every empire believes it understands power. Until the day someone rewrites the rules. And in this case, the ones who rewrote them were the very people no one thought mattered. What would you do if survival placed an impossible choice in front of you? A choice that could change the course of your entire life. A choice that could pull you into a world you never imagined entering. Because long before the power shifted, long before the rival alliances collapsed, and long before a quiet outsider reshaped the balance inside one of the most feared organizations in the city, there was simply a moment, a single decision, one offer placed on a table. For Amara, that offer looked simple on the surface. A contract marriage, temporary, clear terms, financial security in exchange for standing beside a man whose life was surrounded by danger. At the time, she didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know she would eventually sit inside rooms where powerful men debated loyalty and betrayal. She didn't know she would uncover secrets hidden beneath layers of silence. And she certainly didn't know that the very people who dismissed her presence would one day realize she had quietly changed everything. Because in that first moment, none of it existed yet. There was only uncertainty, the risk, the unknown. Walking away would have meant safety, a quieter life, a chance to continue searching for opportunities far from the shadows of organized power. But accepting the offer meant stepping into a reality where every decision carried consequences, where trust was fragile, where every conversation might contain hidden motives, and where survival depended on understanding a world that rarely gave second chances. Most people, when imagining themselves in that position, believe they know the answer. They picture the danger, the tension, the constant pressure of living inside a network built on power and loyalty. And instinctively, they say they would walk away. But life rarely presents choices in such simple terms. Because sometimes, the door that leads to danger is also the only door leading out of the life you're trying to escape. Sometimes the opportunity that feels most risky is also the one capable of transforming everything. And that was the crossroads Amara faced. One path offered familiarity, Struggle, perhaps, but a life she understood. The other path offered uncertainty. A world she had never seen before. A man she barely knew. And a future filled with possibilities she couldn't fully predict. Yet from that single decision, an entire chain of events unfolded. A decision that reshaped alliances, exposed hidden betrayals, and ultimately strengthened the very empire many believed was beginning to fracture. But here's the question that remains long after the story ends. Because when we step away from the headlines, when we strip away the power struggles, the strategy, and the quiet victories inside those tense meetings, we're left with something much more personal. A single choice. One moment where someone had to decide whether to step forward into the unknown or turn back toward the safety of the familiar. So now the question turns to you. If you were standing exactly where Amara stood, facing that same offer, knowing the risks, but also knowing the possibilities, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the marriage? Stepping into a world filled with danger, secrets, and power struggles, hoping you could survive it? Or would you have walked away, choosing distance from the chaos, even if it meant leaving behind an opportunity that might never come again? Think about it carefully, because sometimes the decisions that look the most dangerous are the very ones that rewrite the story of an entire life.